My name is Clara Hayes. For the last 12 years, my life has been charted by the steady, quiet currents of Bridgeport, a city that wears its rain like a soft gray cloak. I live in a small apartment in the Selwood neighborhood, a place where the maple trees canopy the streets and the antique shops hold the quiet histories of 1,000 other lives. From my window, if I lean out just so, I can see the distant steel arches of the Hawthorne Bridge and watch the Willamette River flow, a constant, soothing presence. For most of my adult life, that river was a mirror for my career at Meridian Dynamics. It was steady, predictable, and, I believed, essential to the landscape. I was a project lead in the Digital Archives division, a job that sounds far more sterile than it was. I didn't just manage data, I curated stories. I oversaw the digitization of decades of the company's history, schematics, photographs, early mission statements scrawled on napkins. I found a deep, abiding satisfaction in it, in bringing order to chaos, in preserving the past so the future could have a foundation. My office was a small, sunlit corner on the 7th floor, home to a thriving fiddle-leaf fig I'd named Percival and a collection of mismatched ceramic mugs. It was my sanctuary, a place where I felt not just useful, but rooted. I knew that feeling was an illusion the moment a calendar notification bloomed on my screen. It was a Tuesday morning, the sky a delicate shade of pearl. The meeting was titled Strategic Resource Alignment, scheduled for an unusual time, 10:47 a.m. Not 10:30, not 11 o'clock. 10:47, it was the kind of detail that suggested a decision had already been made, and my presence was merely a formality in a carefully managed timeline. The invite was from Martin in Human Resources, a man I knew only as a disembodied voice from benefits webinars, and my direct supervisor, David, was a required attendee. A cold knot tightened in my stomach, a quiet, dreadful premonition. The conference room, a glass box they called the Narrows, felt airless. David was already there, staring intently into a mug of coffee as if it held the answers to the universe. He was a man who navigated his professional life by avoiding friction, a human path of least resistance. He'd always praised my work in a vague, pleasant way, calling me the bedrock of the department. Now, that bedrock was about to be dynamited, and he couldn't meet my eyes. Martin, a man with a meticulously neat haircut and an expression of practiced neutrality, gestured to the empty chair across the table. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a small, polite gesture, a piece of corporate furniture. "Clara, thank you for joining us," he began, his voice smooth and devoid of any discernible emotion. Then came the script, words polished to a high sheen to obscure their brutal meaning. As Meridian continues to evolve and optimize its operational framework, we've made the difficult decision to restructure several key areas. Your role, unfortunately, has been identified as part of this realignment. Realigned. Redundant. Eliminated. The words floated in the sterile air, clinical and detached. I looked at David, waiting for him to say something, to offer a word of protest, of explanation, of regret. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze still fixed on his coffee. In 12 years of service, of late nights rescuing failed projects and weekends spent migrating servers, this was my reward, to be unmade in a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes, witnessed only by a coward and a bureaucrat. I felt a strange sense of dissociation, as if I were watching a scene from a movie about someone else's life. My own heartbeat sounded distant. Martin slid a sleek, dark blue folder across the table. It landed with a soft, final thud. "This packet contains all the relevant information regarding your separation," he said, his tone unwavering. "You'll find details on your severance, COBRA options, and the timeline for your final compensation." He paused, a flicker of something almost human in his eyes. "We truly do appreciate your long service to Meridian." The word appreciate hung in the air, hollow and absurd. It felt like a stone dropped into a deep well, the splash never coming. Before I could form a question, before my mind could catch up with the shock that was starting to seep into my bones, David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Martin will see you back to your desk," he mumbled, and then he was gone, fleeing the room as if escaping a fire. He didn't look back. The walk back to my office was a blur. It was like I was seeing everything through a film of water. The familiar patterned carpet, the low hum of the servers, the murmur of my colleagues' voices, it all seemed to belong to a world I was no longer a part of. Martin walked beside me, a silent, awkward sentinel. At my desk, the reality began to crash down in waves. My nameplate, a gift from my team after we'd launched a particularly difficult project. The worn-out mousepad with the faded Meridian logo. A framed photo of my sister and me on a hiking trip in the Cascades. And Percival, my fiddle-leaf fig, his leaves glossy and green, reaching for the sunlight. "I'm afraid the plant is company property," Martin said softly, almost apologetically, as I reached for the pot. I looked at him, and for the first time, a spark of defiance flickered through the numbness. "I bought it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I watered it. It's coming with me." He hesitated, then gave a slight nod, as if this small rebellion was a concession he was permitted to make. As I carried my small box of memories and my rescued plant out of the building, past the security desk where the guard gave me a sympathetic glance, a single thought echoed in the sudden, vast emptiness of my mind. They hadn't just let me go. They had tried to erase the last 12 years, to fold them up neatly into a blue folder and file them away. Back in my apartment, the rain had started, a gentle, persistent drumming against the window panes. I set the box on the floor and sank down beside it. My cat, Misty, a small shadow of gray fur and green eyes, emerged from her nap and padded over, winding around my ankles before settling in my lap, her purr a tiny, rumbling motor of comfort. I sat there for a long time, stroking her soft fur, the box of my professional life beside me like a tombstone. I had always imagined leaving Meridian on my own terms, with a farewell party and heartfelt goodbyes, moving on to a new chapter one had chosen for myself. Instead, I had been escorted out like a stranger, my departure a quiet, efficient transaction. But as the evening light faded and the city lights began to glitter across the river, a different feeling began to surface beneath the grief. It was a slow, quiet burn, a feeling not of rage, but of profound injustice. And in the quiet of my living room, surrounded by the life I had built outside of those office walls, I realized that while they had ended my job, they did not have the power to end me. This was not just an ending. It had to be a beginning. That first night was a long, sleepless passage through a landscape of memory and regret. My mind, usually a place of order and calm, was a tumultuous sea. I replayed every project, every success, every time I had stayed late to ensure a deadline was met while David was at home with his family. I remembered the company-wide emails praising team effort when I knew the effort had been largely my own. I had given my loyalty so freely, assuming it was a currency that would one day be honored. The severance packet sat on my coffee table, an insult in a pristine blue folder. 2 weeks' pay for 12 years of my life. It wouldn't even cover a month's rent and my health insurance premiums. Around 3 in the morning, fueled by chamomile tea and a rising sense of indignation, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I retrieved a heavy accordion file from the back of my closet, a place where old, important papers went to be forgotten. It was filled with car titles, old tax returns, and somewhere, tucked in the very back, my original employment offer from Meridian Dynamics, dated March 12, 2011. The paper was thick and creamy, the letterhead embossed. It smelled faintly of dust and forgotten hope. I remembered the day I signed it, the feeling of excitement and security washing over me. I had just left a chaotic startup and Meridian felt like a safe harbor, a place to build a lasting career. I'd read the main points: salary, vacation days, job title, and skimmed the rest, the dense pages of legalese seeming like a distant, irrelevant reality. Now, I read every single word. I read it with the focused, meticulous attention I once gave to my archival projects. Page after page of standard contractual language, of non-disclosure agreements and at-will employment clauses. It was a document designed to protect the company, not the employee. I felt a fresh wave of despair, thinking this was a fool's errand. And then I saw it. On page 7, under a subheading titled Employee Equity and Incentive Program, buried in a paragraph of dense, convoluted prose, was a sentence that made the air catch in my throat. In the event of an employee's involuntary termination by the company without cause, all unvested stock options granted under the company's equity incentive plan shall be subject to immediate and full acceleration of vesting. I read it again, and a third time. My heart began to beat a little faster, a steady, insistent rhythm against the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Involuntary termination without cause. Martin's words echoed in my mind. Your role has been identified as part of this realignment. It wasn't a firing for performance. It wasn't for misconduct. It was, by their own definition, without cause. Immediate and full acceleration of vesting. Over the years, I had received small stock grants as part of my annual reviews. They were acknowledgments of good performance, little slips of paper I'd filed away without much thought. Most of them were on a long-term vesting schedule, digital promises of a future I had never really bothered to calculate. I'd always assumed they were golden handcuffs, worthless unless I stayed for decades. But this clause, this single, forgotten sentence, changed everything. It suggested that the pittance in the blue folder wasn't the final word. It was just the opening offer. Hope, I discovered, doesn't always arrive like a sunrise. Sometimes it's a single candle lit in a vast, dark room. It was small, fragile, and could easily be extinguished. But it was there. I took my phone and snapped a clear picture of the page, the sentence glowing on my screen. I felt a shift inside me, a subtle realignment of my own. The grief was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was no longer passive. It was being joined by a new, sharper feeling, resolve. The next morning, I didn't look at job postings. I looked for a lawyer. I didn't want a bulldog from a downtown firm with a corner office and a view of the city. I wanted someone who understood the quiet histories, the fine print. I found her through a recommendation from a friend in the nonprofit world, Priya Kapoor. Her small practice was located in an old brick building in the Pearl District, above a bookstore that smelled of paper and rain. The reviews described her as sharp, empathetic, and tenacious. One read, Priya doesn't just fight for you, she helps you find your own voice. That was what I needed. Not just to be rescued, but to learn how to stand on my own. Priya Kapoor's office was nothing like the sterile, glass-walled conference rooms at Meridian. It was warm and inviting, lined with overflowing bookshelves and dotted with thriving green plants. It smelled of brewing tea and old paper. Priya herself was a woman in her early 40s with kind, intelligent eyes and a calm, centered presence. She wore a simple linen dress and silver earrings that chimed softly when she moved. She didn't look like a warrior, but I sensed a core of steel beneath her gentle demeanor. Clara, she said, her voice warm as she shook my hand. Thank you for coming in. Please have a seat. Tell me what happened. I had expected to feel nervous, to stumble over my words, but sitting across from her, I found a strange sense of clarity. I told her everything, from the 10:47 a.m. meeting to the hollow apology from David and the insulting severance offer. My voice was steady, infused with the quiet certainty that had been growing since I'd found the contract. Finally, I handed her the printed photo of the clause. She read it, her expression unreadable. Then she read it again, her brow furrowing slightly in concentration. She placed the paper on her desk and looked at me, a long, assessing gaze. And this clause, or any mention of your stock options, was not included in the separation agreement they gave you? She asked. No, I said. Nothing at all. Just the 2 weeks' pay. A slow, thoughtful smile spread across Priya's face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of understanding. They're either incompetent, or they're banking on the fact that you wouldn't read your original contract, she said softly. Often, it's a bit of both. They count on people being too distraught or intimidated to question the narrative they've created. She leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. This is a very strong position, Clara. This isn't a gray area. The language is clear. Your termination was without cause, which triggers this clause. Those shares are, by the letter of their own agreement, yours. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped my lungs in a quiet sigh. To hear it affirmed by someone else, someone who understood this world, was like feeling solid ground beneath my feet after weeks at sea. So, what do we do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What we do now, Priya said, her eyes gleaming with a focus light, is craft a response. We are not going to be aggressive. We are not going to make threats. We are simply going to educate them. We will write a calm, clear, and meticulously documented letter, pointing to this specific clause in your signed contract and politely inquiring as to why it was omitted from their separation offer. We will give them the opportunity to correct their oversight. She paused, her gaze holding mine. This isn't about vengeance, Clara. This is about reclamation. It's about reminding them that your value isn't determined by their realignment strategy. It's determined by the agreements they made and the work you did. It's about getting back what you're owed. Leaving her office, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in weeks. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a silvery light on the wet pavement. I hadn't just found a lawyer, I had found an ally. And for the first time since that dreadful Tuesday, I felt like I was no longer a victim of my story, but the author of its next chapter. The days that followed were a lesson in patience. Priya had warned me that the most difficult part would be the waiting. Once we send the letter, we go silent, she'd explained. We let it land. The silence will be their problem, not ours. She drafted the letter with the precision of a surgeon. It was a masterpiece of polite, unassailable logic. It began by acknowledging receipt of their separation packet, then gently pivoted. It quoted the equity clause from my contract verbatim, cited the date of my termination, and connected the two with clean, simple language. The letter's closing was its most brilliant part. It didn't demand or threaten, it simply requested clarification on this apparent discrepancy, and stated that I was delaying signature on the severance agreement pending the company's response. The letter was sent via email and certified mail at 9 a.m. on a Monday. And then, the silence began. For me, the silence was deafening. Every ping of my phone made my heart leap. Every email notification was a potential earthquake. I tried to distract myself. I repotted Percival into a larger, more beautiful ceramic pot. I took long, meandering walks along the East Bank Esplanade, watching the cyclists and the rowers on the river. I spent an afternoon at Powell's, losing myself in the endless aisles of books, the scent of paper a comforting balm. But my mind was never far from the invisible chessboard where Priya had just made our first move. I imagined the letter arriving on Martin's desk. I pictured him reading it, his neutral expression finally cracking. I saw him walking down the hall to David's office, or worse, to the legal department. I imagined the hushed conversations, the frantic search for my employee file, the dawning horror as they realized their standard policy had $1 million loophole. On the third day of silence, I nearly broke. The doubt that had been a faint whisper grew into a roar. What if they had a counter-argument? What if some other document I'd signed over the years superseded this one? What if they just ignored us? I called Priya, my voice tight with anxiety. They won't ignore it, she said, her tone as calm and steady as a ship's anchor. A letter like this, from a lawyer, citing a specific contractual obligation, cannot be ignored. It creates a paper trail of their knowledge. Right now, Clara, they are not strategizing how to fight us. They're strategizing how to manage their mistake. Breathe. Trust the process. Her confidence was a lifeline. I held onto it. The first ripple came on Friday morning. An email from a former colleague, a kind woman from the marketing department named Sophie. We hadn't been close, but we'd always been friendly. Her message was short and cautious. "Hey Clara, just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Thinking of you. Things have been a little intense around here this week." That was it. Intense. The word was a flare in the darkness. It was confirmation that our quiet, polite letter had landed with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. The silence from the company wasn't indifference, it was panic. The dam finally broke the following Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Priya's letter had been sent. My phone rang, displaying a name I never expected to see again: David. My former boss. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let Priya handle everything. But then, a different impulse took over, a need to face this myself. I took a deep breath and answered. "Hello, David." His voice was strained, stripped of its usual easygoing tone. "Clara. I'm glad I caught you. I was hoping we could talk." "We can," I said, my own voice surprisingly calm. I walked over to my window and looked out at the familiar view of the bridge, a steady, unmoving landmark. "Look," he began, stumbling over his words. "This whole situation, it's gotten a bit out of hand. That letter your lawyer sent. Clara, nobody intended for this to be so adversarial." "I don't see it as adversarial, David," I replied gently. "I see it as me holding the company to an agreement it wrote. An agreement you signed off on when you hired me." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "The thing is, the equity clause, it's an old legacy clause. It wasn't supposed to be in the boilerplate for hires at your level anymore. It was an oversight that it was in your contract at all. An oversight that benefited me, it seems," I said, a touch of steel in my voice. "Just as the oversight in my severance package was designed to benefit the company." He was silent for a moment. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, searching for a new angle, a new way to appeal to the compliant, uncomplaining Clara he thought he knew. "The board is involved now," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as if sharing a great secret. "The CFO is concerned about the financial implications. This is causing a lot of trouble, Clara. For a lot of people." He paused. "I always valued you. You know that. I thought we had a good working relationship." And there it was. The appeal to loyalty, the subtle implication that I was being unreasonable, that I was betraying a relationship he had already single-handedly severed in a 10-minute meeting. The old me would have felt a pang of guilt. The old me would have wanted to smooth things over, to make him feel better. But I was not the old me. "David," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "Our working relationship ended the day you let Martin walk me out of the building. My only relationship with Meridian now is contractual. I'm sorry this is causing you trouble, I truly am. But the trouble was created by the company's actions, not by mine. I'm simply asking for what was promised to me." He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "They want to schedule a meeting with you and your lawyer to discuss a resolution. Priya will be in touch to coordinate," I said. I didn't add anything else. I didn't need to. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I ended the call and stood by the window, watching the river flow. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had not raised my voice. I had not been vindictive. I had simply stood my ground, spoken my truth, and refused to be diminished. And it was enough. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday in the same glass-walled conference room where I'd been fired. Walking into the Meridian Dynamics building this time was an entirely different experience. I wasn't a dismissed employee being escorted out. I was a principal in a negotiation, walking in beside my legal counsel. Priya was a picture of serene confidence in a deep sapphire dress, her leather briefcase held loosely in one hand. I wore a simple gray suit, feeling not like a warrior going into battle, but like a woman coming to claim what was rightfully hers. The room was full. On one side of the long, polished table sat Mr. Croft, the company's CEO, a man with a year-round tan and an air of forced affability. Beside him were two stone-faced lawyers from Meridian's corporate counsel, and next to them, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable, sat Martin. David was conspicuously absent. Mr. Croft stood as we entered, extending a hand with a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Clara, Ms. Kapoor, thank you for coming. We're all here today to find an amicable path forward." Priya gave a slight nod and placed her briefcase on the table, but she didn't open it. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice calm and clear. "I think we can expedite this process. My client's position is quite simple. The employment contract she signed contains a specific clause regarding the acceleration of her unvested stock options upon termination without cause. She was terminated without cause. Therefore, those options are now fully vested. We are here to discuss the logistics of that transfer." One of the lawyers, a man with sharp features and a sharper suit, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Ms. Kapoor, it is the company's position that the clause in question is a relic of a previous contractual template and its inclusion was a clerical error. A clerical error that was ratified by the company and signed by its authorized representatives?" Priya countered, raising an eyebrow. "A contract is a contract, Mr. Nolan. I'm sure you'd argue the same if the error was in the company's favor." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Mr. Croft held up a hand, resuming his role as peacemaker. "Let's not get bogged down in semantics. We acknowledge that there has been an oversight. We value Clara's long service to this company, and we want to do right by her. To that end, we are prepared to make a very generous offer to resolve this matter today." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a settlement offer. A number was written on it, a significant number, far more than the initial severance, but a fraction of what I knew the fully vested shares were worth, especially with the company's rumored acquisition on the horizon. And at the bottom, in bold letters, were the words, "Subject to a comprehensive non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement." They weren't just offering me money. They were offering to buy my silence. I looked at the paper, then I looked at Priya. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent signal that the choice was mine. This was my moment of truth. I could take the money, sign the paper, and walk away from this chapter of my life forever. It was the easy path, the path of no more conflict. But as I looked at the faces across the table, the strained smile of the CEO, the defensive posture of the lawyers, the downcast eyes of Martin, I realized it wasn't about the money. Not anymore. It was about the principle. It was about the 12 years they had so easily dismissed. It was about the fact that they were still trying to manage me, to control the narrative, to erase their mistake with a check and a gag order. I took a deep breath and pushed the paper back across the table. "No, thank you," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Every head at the table snapped toward me. Mr. Croft's smile vanished completely. "I'm sorry," he asked, as if he'd misheard. "The offer is generous, Mr. Croft," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "But I'm not interested in signing a non-disclosure agreement. I don't believe my story, or your company's clerical error, is something that needs to be hidden." Priya stepped in, her tone smooth as silk. "As my client has indicated, a settlement of that nature is not what we are here to discuss. We are here to facilitate the execution of the terms of her existing contract. We have a simple proposal. The company will transfer the full value of all vested shares to my client within 5 business days. There will be no NDA. There will be no further negotiation. You will simply honor the agreement you wrote." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Alternatively," she continued, her voice hardening ever so slightly, "my client can retain the shares as an active shareholder. And as a shareholder, she would be well within her rights to raise certain questions about corporate governance and employee management practices at the next shareholders' meeting." I imagine the story of a 12-year loyal employee being terminated with a faulty severance package that conveniently overlooks a significant equity stake would be of great interest to other investors. The threat was unspoken but hung in the air, heavy and potent. The room was utterly silent. The lawyers exchanged panicked glances. Martin looked like he might actually slide under the table. Mr. Croft stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. He was seeing me for the first time, not as a functionary, not as a line item in a budget, but as a person with agency and power. He held my gaze for a long, tense moment, and then he deflated, the fight visibly draining out of him. He turned to his lead counsel and said, his voice flat with defeat, "Draw up the paperwork for the transfer. No conditions." Walking out of that building and into the soft Bridgeport afternoon, I felt a sense of release so profound it was almost dizzying. It wasn't the giddy thrill of victory. It was the deep, quiet satisfaction of having stood up for myself and been heard. It was the feeling of reclaiming a part of my own story that I had allowed others to write for too long. The money arrived in my account 4 days later. The number was large enough to be life-altering, but the feeling it gave me was not one of wealth, but of freedom. The freedom to take my time, to heal, to decide what came next on my own terms. I didn't rush into a new job. Instead, I gave myself the gift of a quiet season. I took a pottery class, delighting in the messy, tactile process of creating something with my own hands. I volunteered at the local library, surrounded by the quiet hum of stories. I took Percival, my fiddle-leaf fig, and placed him in the sunniest spot in my apartment, where he continued to thrive. Sometimes, walking along the river, I think about the people at Meridian. I don't feel anger anymore, only a kind of distant pity. They live in a world of glass walls and bottom lines, a world where loyalty is a liability and people can be realigned. I have no idea if David kept his job, or if Martin ever learned to look people in the eye. It doesn't matter. Their story is no longer tangled up with mine. My own story is still being written. I don't know what the next chapter holds, whether I'll start a small business, go back to school, or simply find a new corner office with a better view. But I know that whatever I do, I will do it with a newfound understanding of my own worth, an understanding forged in the quiet fire of being broken and the gentle strength of putting myself back together. The river still flows, constant and steady, but now, when I look at it, I see my own reflection, a woman who learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to hold your ground, speak your truth, and quietly, irrevocably, refuse to be erased.